Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Yonsei International Conference. Let me introduce myself briefly. I'm Sung Lim. As Associate Professor of New Testament, I'm teaching at Yonsei University. Currently, I'm also serving as Associate Dean of College of Theology. This year, Yonsei University, College of Theology, and United Graduate School of Theology hold a conference entitled War, Peace, and Religion. On the occasion of the 72nd anniversary of the Korean War, the Koreans and global citizens are confronted with the catastrophe of Ukraine caused by the invasion of Russia. To respond to this ongoing crisis of Ukraine from a theological perspective, as moderator of the conference, I have invited several prominent scholars to this event. Professor Yury P. Avvakumov from University of Notre, Professor Miguel Torre from Iliff School of Theology, Professor Carey from Lancaster Theological Seminary, Professor Yoon from Yonsei University, and myself. The first speaker is Professor Avvakumov. He is Associate Professor of History of Christianity at the Department of Theology at University of Notre. He used to teach in Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, and especially he served as Dean of Humanities at the Ukraine Catholic University. Now, Avvakumov will have some speech about the crisis of Ukraine.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I'm happy to speak in this context. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began on February 24th, is most likely going to determine the history not only of Europe, but also directly or indirectly of the entire world for the next years, if not decades. The war, raging for over 3 months already, has cost dozens of thousands of lives. Thousands of civilians, including over 300 children, have been slaughtered. 8 million people have been forced to flee their homes and are seeking refuge elsewhere within Ukraine or internationally. Numerous evidences of war crimes and atrocities, including of the rape of women and children, have been reported from the recently liberated regions around the capital of Kiev. Whole cities, towns, and villages have been razed to the ground by the aggressor. The word genocide has been repeatedly brought forward to describe the atrocities of this war. Today, the war unremittingly continues and even intensifies. An East European country of 40 million population faces human suffering of biblical proportions. Russia's war against Ukraine challenges the contemporary world with numerous troubling questions. How did it happen that post-Soviet Russia turned into an authoritarian militaristic dictatorship in the plain sight of the entire world, instead of becoming a democratic state? What, if any, responsibility do the West and its political leaders bear for this frightful development? What is the nature of Putin's political regime and its ideology? How did it happen that Putin's propaganda has been able to gain an influence over public opinion in many countries of the world? What are the intellectual, political, religious roots of the ideology propagated by Putin and his media? Why were Ukrainians and their national and religious identity and culture overlooked in the international community and seen as a sort of subspecies of Russia for so long? What would Russia's bid for world dominance, if successful, mean for the future of international relations and the international world order? What moral principles should guide the handling of the refugee crisis in Europe and worldwide? How can peace, justice, and stability be achieved in Ukraine, Russia, and all the regions and countries formerly belonging to the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc and Europe in Asia? All these questions can and should, I think, be approached from theological perspectives. Recent initiatives undertaken by theologians of various confessions show that numerous colleagues from different countries and continents clearly see the urgency of these issues. Just a few days after the full-scale invasion began, a group of 30 theologians, most of them members of the Vatican's International Theological Commissions, issued a brief and energetic statement in support of Ukraine, which is now available on the website of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, the statement has received over 400 signatures by theologians from at least 25 countries in Europe, both Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia. This statement, issued predominantly by Catholic theologians, has been echoed by a deeply thoughtful statement of over 400 Orthodox colleagues who undertook a detailed doctrinal analysis of the Ruski Mir, Russian world ideology propagated by contemporary Russian Orthodox religious leadership. Their theological analysis concluded that this teaching constitutes a dangerous heresy. There is a vast number of other collective and individual statements of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant theologians and church leaders available in public media, which demonstrate the degree of urgency perceived today by Christians worldwide in connection with the current situation. In my brief talk, I am not able to address all the related questions, of course. I will provide just a few comments primarily on the role of religion and religious leaders in this war. In international ecumenical organizations and boardrooms, there has been much astonishment at the fact that the Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, not only has not uttered a word of condemnation of the invasion and its atrocities, but quite the contrary, unambiguously supported the war and repeatedly praised Russian military for their actions. Contrary to this widespread surprise, I think Kirill's actions could actually be expected and even predicted. They look to me like a logical consequence of the entire Soviet and Russian religious history of the last 4 centuries. To explain the Russian actions and the Ukrainian defense, I think one thing is important to clearly see from historical perspective. Russia's war against Ukraine is a colonial war, and precisely as such, it will inevitably have global impact and global consequences. We tend to cast the history of colonialism in terms of Europe versus all other continents. We should not forget, however, that Europe has its own history of inner European colonialism. One of the main colonial powers in Eastern Europe was the Russian Tsarist Empire of the Romanov dynasty. Contrary to, say, British or Portuguese overseas colonialism, Russian colonialism was continental and was directed against its neighboring ethnicities and cultures, both in Asia, primarily in Siberia, and in Eastern Europe. Ukrainians has been victims of this inner European Moscow's colonialism since the 17th century. 1654 is the year which marks the beginning of the annexation of Ukrainian territories by the early modern Muscovite Tsardom. This annexation process, which included local wars, devastations, terror, and bloodshed, lasted for over 3 centuries. The conflict was not only about territories, it was a battle of an autocratic, despotic Muscovite regime with the spontaneous democratism of the Ukrainian Cossack nation. Thus, Ukrainian military defense today is a response to this specific type of Russian colonialism, the defense of a nation which aspires its own independent state constructed on democratic principles, contrasting the long tradition of Russia's despotic authoritarianism. On the side of the Kremlin, this war is an attempt to revive the colonial geopolitics and ideology of the 19th century, combining it with the political and military practices of the recent communist past. This combination of some elements of the Russian Tsarist imperial ideology with a Soviet political legacy seems a strange, even bizarre hybrid to many outside observers today. It is indeed an aesthetically bizarre alloy, but from a historian's point of view, it is not so strange as it may seem at first glance. Let us recall that the Russian Tsarist Empire collapsed and ceased to exist in the course of the World War I in 1917, like it happened with the Ottoman, the Habsburg, Austrian, Hungarian, and the German empires. Contrary to the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires, however, the Russian Empire was able to restore itself paradoxically in an anti-Tsarist, atheistic, communist form of the Soviet Union. Bolshevist leaders managed to bring back, under the domination of Moscow, almost all the former colonies of the Russian Empire, except a few territories like Finland, for example. Ukraine was one of the territories retaken by force. The year 1991, by marking the dissolution of the USSR, marks also the collapse of that Bolshevist communist attempt to prolong the existence of a colonial empire. The post-Soviet Russia is a strange state. Russian propagandists like to talk of Ukraine being a failed state. In my view, it is the post-Soviet Russia which has been, in fact, a failed state, or rather, a failed nation. On the one hand, it has retained a number of colonies, both in the European and in the Asian parts of its territory. On the other hand, large pieces of the empire, both in Europe and in Asia, like Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia in Europe, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan in Asia, was able to secede and acquire independence. With Putin and Putinism, we have to do with another attempt to restore the old 19th century style colonial empire. Precisely this, and not only the nostalgic feelings for his KGB past in the Soviet Union, made Putin repeatedly declare in public that he regards the dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The Kremlin refuses to recognize that the time of colonialism is irreversibly gone. The ideology of contemporary Russian leaders is a bizarre hodgepodge of the shallow worldview of a mid-level Soviet KGB officer with elements of the 19th century geopolitics of the orthodoxy, autocracy, nationhood concept of the Russian Tsarist Empire. At this point, religion, in the form of Russian Orthodoxy, enters the stage. In the current Russian-Ukrainian war, which constitutes something that could be called one of the last totally anachronistic fits of Muscovite colonialism, religion plays an extremely important role. Religious communities and its leaders are prominent actors on both sides of this global conflict. In the self-defense of the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian religious communities understand themselves as advocates for the Ukrainian people, for their civil rights and for their liberty. On the opposite side, the Russian initiators and promoters of the war against Ukraine seek and believe to have found a religious legitimation of the war with the help of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, the church which has attempted since the collapse of the Soviet Union to replace the communist ideology with Eastern Orthodoxy and to make the latter the official ideology of the post-Soviet Russian state. The Russian Orthodox clergy has become willing promoters, if not the co-inventors, of the new Russian imperial militaristic ideology. One of the instruments of this ideology is the concept of Holy Rus. This concept appeals to the nationalistic historical grand narrative that was created in the Russian Tsarist Empire in the early 19th century. This narrative presented the history of Ukrainian lands with a center in Kiev as a part of the history of Russia, centered around Moscow. The baptism of Rus, which, according to a legend, took place in Kiev in 988, began to be seen as the foundational event for the Russian nation, the nation that, in the view of the Holy Rus ideologists, consists of three parts. First, the so-called Great Russians, or Muscovites. Second, Ukrainians, or Little Russians. And third, Belarusians, or White Russians. In this ideology, Ukrainians are nothing more than a peculiar folkloric subspecies of the great Russian nation, a subspecies which has no right for an independent existence. These nationalist and imperialist paradigms of the 19th century have been revived in the recent decades by the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It was Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, not the political leadership of Russia, who first began to publicly promote the idea of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, or Russian space. This Russian expression is translated in both ways, can be translated in both ways, as Russian world or Russian space. The ideological construct meant to embrace Russians and Russian-speaking people over the entire planet, all of them belonging, from the standpoint of the Moscow Patriarchate, to the area of the pastoral care of the Russian Orthodox Church. That Ukrainians and Belarusians were seen as primary members of the Russian world, alongside with the Russians, became clear during Kirill's frequent visits to Ukraine in the years 2008 to 2012, that were conducted under the slogan, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the one holy Rus. In 2014, the idea of the Russian world served as a pretext and ideological legitimation of Russia's annexation of Crimea, which Putin declared possessed a sacred meaning for the Russians, and of the military intervention in eastern regions of Ukraine. The concept of one holy Rus denies Ukrainians and Belarusians their right for independence, the political independence from the Kremlin, and the cultural and religious independence from the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. I would actually go even further and say that, in my view, the ideology of Holy Rus and of the so-called Russian world or Russian space has a clear racist undertone, since it approaches the two neighboring nations, Ukrainians and Belarusians, and these nations as a whole, as a sort of imperfect Russians, little Russians, sub-Russians, not worthy of being recognized as genuine nations. This ideology is politically toxic and therefore, in fact, pseudo-Christian. When facing such a reality, we must be wary of taking these pseudo-theological constructs for pure theology. We, precisely as theologians and church historians, must be prepared to expose the presence of an aggressive and militaristic political message within the constructs that might sound as pious, well-minded, and even otherworldly at first glance. Comparing Russia and Ukraine in terms of their religious past and present, I think one thing should be made clear. There is an asymmetry, a substantial difference between Ukraine and Russia in respect to the religious situation. The peaceful coexistence of various Christian jurisdictions, including Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox jurisdictions, has been a factor of particular importance for ecumenical relations. For decades, there existed at least 3, at times even 4 various Orthodox jurisdictions independent from each other. Even if there were certain tensions between them, all in all, they coexisted peacefully, and everyone understood that the Ukrainian state guarantees the freedom of religion for every community. Since it acquired independence in 1991, Ukraine has been a country in which the state managed to create a legal and political framework for interconfessional tolerance and ecumenical cooperation. In this sense, as in so many other aspects, Ukraine is the opposite of contemporary Russia, which is a country in which one religious institution, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, claims the dominating position in the state, so that all other Christian denominations, Catholics and Protestants among them, are treated as second-class religious communities. Any dissent inside Russian Orthodoxy is suppressed with particularly harsh means. In Ukraine, on the contrary, diverging jurisdictional affiliations among the Orthodox, as well as interconfessional and interreligious diversity, are overall tolerated and accepted despite occasional tensions. Perhaps the clearest example of ecumenical cooperation in Ukraine is the existence, now already for over 25 years, of the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which unites not only different Orthodox jurisdictions and various Christian denominations, but also the heads of the Jewish and the Muslim communities in Ukraine. It counts 16 members overall. Such a council of churches would be unthinkable in contemporary Russia. The Ukrainian Council of Churches has been quite successful in providing public response to urgent problems of political and social life in Ukraine. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, the Council issued numerous statements and appeals on the most urgent problems connected with the war, in particular on the situation in Mariupol, on Russian genocidal actions in Bucha and other towns of the Kievan region, on prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine, and many others. These appeals are powerful demonstrations of solidarity among various Christian confessions and religious communities in Ukraine. To conclude, in my view, the nominal, ideological, geopolitical, even racist Christianity propagated by the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church today has little or nothing to do with a genuine Christian message. It is a pseudo-Christianity. By supporting the unprovoked war against the neighboring nation, by giving its blessing to the war, the Moscow Patriarchate, in fact, commits a blasphemy. And thus, I think it's an obligation for all Christians, for all church leaders and theologians all over the world who want to stay faithful to the humanist message of the Christian doctrine, to respond first by unambiguously condemning the Russian aggression and supporting on Ukraine and Ukrainians in their struggle for their country, and for the ideals of the democratic, free world, for the world in which every human being created in God's image and likeness is respected. And secondly, we must condemn and sever ecumenical cooperation with those Russian church leaders who have over decades provided ideological justification of Russian aggressive policy, and who now give their blessing to the aggression and to the war. No more business as usual with the church hierarchs who have tainted themselves by the sacrilegious support of war crimes. Theologically, I feel reminded of Jesus's words from the Gospel of Matthew. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. There are such pivotal turning moments in history that make these words sound particularly relevant. And I'm afraid we now find ourselves precisely in such a moment of history. Academically, in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, in the time when so many people and scholars among them take sides in this conflict, we hear voices warning us against political engagement in research and underscoring the necessity of scientific objectivity. Absolutely supporting the objectivity requirement in the humanities, in the sense that it is our obligation to follow our sources in our research. Let me, however, call for a deeper look at the issue. The dichotomy, either political engagement or objectivity in research, seems to me insufficient. Political engagement is not the only option. We should add a third member to this picture: moral engagement. And there are particular cases in which moral engagement is not only permitted, but indispensable. It is especially true for the area of church history and theology. The dark, allow me to say almost diabolical nature of the Putinist ideology and the Putinist church must be named by name. The ability to distinguish between the right and the wrong, and, if you like, take sides with the right cause, belongs, in my view, to the foundational aspects of any honest research endeavor in the humanities and in theology and church history in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent speech here, Professor Yury Avvakumov. The second speaker is Miguel A. Torre. He is a professor of social ethics and Latin studies at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, USA. Now he is now in Germany, but because due to kind of any trouble caused by internet, so we are going to have the record.
Hello. I want to thank the folks at Yonsei University for inviting me to be part of this discussion. It is pre-recorded just in case there was difficulty with the internet and me being able to be with you live. I'm traveling and through different countries right now, and some of the connectivity is difficult. So I want to begin with making a few disclaimers. And the first disclaimer is that I am a liberationist ethicist. That is, I approach ethics from the perspective of marginalized and oppressed people. So that's the lens that I am using in today's discussion. Secondly, I'm against all wars. I'm even against the next war that occurs, whatever that may be. All wars are morally reprehensible, and basically because those on the periphery of power are seldom consulted about going to war, even though they are disproportionately on the receiving end of violence. All violence is wrong, not just the violence of war, but also the institutional violence, the violence that does not come with guns, but comes with systematic structures that perpetuate the oppression of marginalized community. And also, in the face of this violence, the question then becomes, what is the praxis, what is the action that we must engage in the midst of war? There was a continuous actual physical war in the Ukraine. I mean, Russia invaded the Ukraine and was negatively impacting the Ukraine since 2014. But also there's a continuous institutional violence. And the example is people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans here in the United States. They also are facing a silent war of institutional violence. And I want to bring these two types of wars together in today's discussion. The third disclaimer I want to make is that I stand in solidarity with the oppressed. Regardless if they are right or wrong, the oppressed deserves us to stand in solidarity with them. I always give the example that I have two children, and when they were younger, my son, which is 1 year older than my daughter, sometimes we'll get into a fight with her, and he could easily pin her down. So if I would see that, I will pull him away from her, and he could tell me, well, Dad, this is unfair. You're supposed to love us both the same. To which I would reply, I love you both the same, but you're taller and bigger and more powerful. So I will always stand in solidarity with the oppressed, in this case, my daughter, even if she's wrong. Because the issue is not right or wrong. The issue is who has the power to oppress the other. So I always stand in solidarity with the oppressed. The fourth disclaimer is trying to understand who's being oppressed in this current conflict in the Ukraine or in anywhere. And in reality, whoever is invaded, those are the oppressed. Those who don't belong in the land, who enter into someone else's land, those are the oppressors. And there's a brutality that comes with invasion. So the question then we have to answer is that even though I'm a pacifist, even though I don't believe in violence, does solidarity with the oppressed include helping the oppressed in their self-defense? In other words, while I abhor violence, in an imperfect and messy world where violence and institutional violence are given, do I have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with those seeking this self-defense? I believe the answer is yes. But when I say that, there were certain complexities that we need to consider. And I'm going to talk about four basic complexities. The first one is money for war, and not people. There's always money to kill people. There's never enough money to provide people with a flourishing life. Since April, the United States has spent $13.6 billion in support for the Ukrainians. And the House of Representatives just passed a bill for an additional $40 billion. That's a lot of money. Money that's not used to help, the public, to help the poor. And while I understand that we need to stand in solidarity with the oppressed in the Ukraine, and I'm not speaking against that, at the same time, I want to point out the obscenity of the money that is used to create war. In 2022, the United States has earmarked $754 billion for its military operations. In other words, we have the strongest military in the world, representing 10.5% of the US budget and accounting as the second largest expense category within that budget, contributing over $30 trillion towards our debt. The military budget, the United States military budget, represents 39% of the world's total military budget. In other words, if you were to combine the next 11 countries after the United States with the largest militaries, they would not equal the US military budget. So we spend a tremendous amount of money to maintain the dominance of the United States within the global economy. And there's something wrong with that. There is something wrong with spending so much money to make sure that when it comes to military, we're number one, but when it comes to social services, education, healthcare, we are dead last. President Eisenhower in the 1950s made a speech, and I want to quote what he said because I think this is so important. And considering that President Eisenhower used to be the supreme commander during the Second World War, he said, quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launch, every rocket fire signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It's 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It's 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging on a cross of iron." And he said this in 1953, trying to warn the United States not to become this military powerhouse that it did. So if I was to update Eisenhower's words, I would say that it's not the American Indian living in the squatter of a reservation that wants new jets. It's not the African Americans relegated to the ghettos of this country who want new bombers. It's not the Latinos who live on the borderlands that are asking for more guns. We are not the ones calling for this hardware. And yet, that is where our future is being invested. So that first complexity is just that the money that we spend to become the most powerful military in the world is robbing the people of a flourishing life. The second complexity to this whole issue is that when Russia invades another country, it is evil. When the United States invades another country, it's protecting freedoms and it's fighting for freedom. And there's a certain hypocrisy in that clear dichotomy. Not again, don't get me wrong. The invasion of the Ukraine is evil. But by the same token, the invasion of any country under any pretext is also evil. We forget that in the 19th century, in the 20th century, this last century that we just went through, the United States invaded 21 countries along the Caribbean. That's Mexico, Central America, and the islands of the Caribbean. 21 times the United States sent the Marines boots on the ground in order to change the government. Regime change is what Bush would call it 100 years later. Besides that, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, conducted over 26 that we know of covert operations to overthrow governments. In some cases, like in Guatemala, democratically elected governments. So that means that in the last 100 years, during the 20th century, the United States invaded or attempted a covert operation 47 times. That's once every 2 years that we try to regime change. My own country, from where I come from, Cuba, the United States invaded us 4 times and was engaged in at least 2 covert operations by the CIA. All this to say that what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, we have been doing for over 100 years. But when they do it, it's evil. And when we do it, we're protecting freedom. But when we say protecting freedom, we're not protecting the freedom of human rights. We're protecting the freedoms of economic markets. In other words, the freedom of those markets being open to our penetration. And all these wars begin under false pretense. For the Russians, the Ukrainians were a Nazi government that was genociding ethnic Russians. For the United States, when we invaded Iraq, it was because they had weapons of mass destruction. In both cases, that is wrong, and in both cases, that has been proven to be untrue. So again, I'm not trying to take away from the aggression of Russia. I simply want to say that all aggression, all invasions, no matter who does it, is evil. The third complexity, sympathy for the refugee. No doubt the refugees of Ukraine deserve our sympathy and deserve our attempt to help them during this time of need. But to make this more complex, where was the sympathy for the Syrians in 2016, when Russia did pretty much the same thing that it's doing in the Ukraine in places like Aleppo? According to the 2019 United Nations report, Russia conducted human rights violation, bombing and targeting schools, hospitals, fleeing civilians, the same thing that we are seeing going on in the Ukraine now. But the world, and the United States specifically, was silent during that time. We didn't care about Aleppo. You can say the same thing about Chechen in 2000. Again, Human Rights Watch concluded that the Russians were engaged in killing, arson, rape, looting. The same things that happened in ID are happening in the Ukraine now. So why is there a difference? Why do we care so much about the Ukraine and yet pretty much ignore Chechen and Syria? And I believe the answer is because Ukrainians are blonde, blue-eyed Europeans. So there's a racism engaged in who we feel sympathy for and who we rush to help. And again, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to take away from the sufferings of the Ukraine, and I'm not saying that we should not help the Ukraine. What I am saying is that all humans, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, deserves our sympathy when they are being abused and when they are being decimated. And the last comment before my time runs out, the last complexity of this whole issue is that this war in the Ukraine is being framed as a war between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think that's the wrong way of seeing this conflict. I would instead argue that we're talking about a war between the colonizer and the colonized. This is a war where Russia and the United States have more in common than the Ukrainian and other people who are being invaded by these superpowers. Again, it's not to say that we shouldn't be sympathetic with the Ukraine, but what I'm trying to say is that Russia and the United States have much more in common than they led on to be in this conflict. Both powers are interested in controlling the destiny and the sovereignties of other nations. And both are using the rhetoric of freedom and righteousness to impose that power. So the real conflict of the future are not going to be between democracy and authoritarian powers. I really believe the conflicts of the future are going to be between the colonized and the colonizers. And that means, unfortunately, that we'll be seeing more wars, of which I'm against. But at the same token, I have to stand in solidarity with those who are being persecuted in those wars. And then the ethical question, the one that I don't have an answer to, the one that I am still wrestling with, is how do I stand in solidarity with those who are the victims of war? And standing in solidarity also mean engaging in self-defense. Obviously, violence is already occurring, both through war or systematically. The question becomes, what is my response to that violence? And if the self-defense increase that violence? And these are strong ethical questions that I don't have the answer to. I only wrestle with. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your speech, Miguel. The third speaker is Carey. He's a professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary. So, Greg, are you ready?
I'm ready. I'd like to begin by thanking Professors Yoon and Lim for collecting this conference, for inviting me, which is an honor, and to Misters Lee and Sol for making this happen so well, and to acknowledge my gratitude for the wisdom we've received from Yury and from Miguel. Jesus, Luke tells us, is confronted with an atrocity. What comment can he offer regarding the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices? Jesus joins this report with another tragedy, the fall of a tower that killed 18 persons. As we can see from his response, Jesus apparently has not taken the required course in pastoral care. He does not ask probing questions or display empathy. Instead, he replies, "Unless you repent, you will all perish as they did." Jesus' words challenge his followers. Human tragedy, even violence, implicates all of us. That's all the more so in a modern world where nations participate in war without directly wielding weapons, whether through economic means, diplomacy, military support, or other strategies, and where citizens participate in this violence by voting and paying taxes. Commentators scramble to explain the theology that undergirds Jesus' call to repent. I will not attempt such an explanation, but I will ask, how does Russia's invasion of Ukraine bear upon those of us who observe it largely from a distance and yet are in reality participants in the conflict? Russia's aggression in Ukraine presents an unavoidable challenge to persons who treasure human dignity and democracy. The invasion also represents a rupture in the global church, as the larger communion of Orthodox churches have acknowledged the autocephaly of the global Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And while the Russian Orthodox Church insists upon its authority over the Ukrainian church, and the Russian Patriarch continues to bless the invasion. A Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church also holds strong representation and stands in some tension with the other two predominant churches. The church's division is a scandal. It compromises Christians' moral witness. As with all moral crises, the aggression raises the question, does Christianity bear a distinctive witness to this matter? Christians routinely turn to Scripture in forming our moral positions. Yet we Protestants are beginning to learn that the Bible rarely, if ever, provides definitive moral guidance for modern dilemmas, at least not directly. Here in the United States, appeals to the Bibles did not resolve church debates over slavery, segregation, matters related to divorce, the authorization of women for religious leadership, the separation of church and state, and recently, matters related to gender and sexuality and the matter of immigration. This is the case for two primary reasons. Let us consider the case of immigration. First, the biblical witness to matters such as these can be quite diverse. For example, the question of migration runs from the Bible, from the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, to the nations finding blessing in the New Jerusalem. Most of the biblical witnesses encourages compassion for migrants. We note especially Israel's creed, a wandering Aramean was my ancestor, and the infant Jesus status as a refugee. Yet, some sections of the Bible, Ezra perhaps the most obvious, are hostile toward cultural mixing. The Bible has much to say about care for the vulnerable, but it will not do to resolve the problem simply by asserting the Bible says. Second, biblical application requires attention to history and culture. Migration has always been a fraud issue. Migrants have broadly faced exclusion and exploitation. But our modern system of nation states with complex systems for enforcing borders, providing social services, and managing populations differs wildly from the scenes reflected in Abraham's journeys and Paul's missionary activity. Perhaps war has changed less in its fundamental reality, its impact upon the vulnerable, its potential to destroy whole societies, and its capacity to damage the lived environment. Yet even warfare takes on new dimensions in a highly technological and globalized age. The Bible speaks to us best, not when we consult it with a topical index, but when we're formed by its manifold witness, shaped by its stories, poems, and correspondences. Although the Bible presents us with many serious theological and ethical problems, throughout the centuries, Christians have been shaped individually and collectively through deep encounter with Scripture. We learn to love our neighbor, to offer grace and healing as we have received them, to build community and practice reconciliation, and to foster peace and well-being. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Most believers find our encounters with the New Testament to give us a strong bias toward peace and an aversion toward violence. What then may we say about the war and about Ukraine? Russia's invasion is an atrocity, now known as an act of imperial aggression. Russian troops have kidnapped Ukrainians and taken them to Russia, targeted and assassinated political leaders at local and national levels, practiced rape as a technique of terror, destroyed farm equipment, and mined agricultural fields. It requires no act of Christian discernment to recognize that we must resist this aggression and work for a peace that honors Ukrainian self-determination and security, and hopefully deliver Russia from violence and destruction. For these reasons, humility is in order as we bring the New Testament witnesses to bear upon the problem of war. It will not do simply to throw verses at one another as if they were weapons. Those who believe war is sometimes justified have things to say. We do not read the New Testament in isolation from Israel's scriptures, where Israel's God not only blesses war, but participates in it. John describes Jesus as deploying a whip in the temple. Luke's Jesus advises disciples to equip themselves with swords, a saying that vexes commentators. The Gospels and Acts present soldiers, especially centurions, as model citizens. Paul acknowledges the state's right to wield the sword. On my reading, at least, Revelation does not call those who follow the Lamb to participate in war, but heaven rejoices when violence overcomes the dragon and the beast. We cannot say that with confidence that the New Testament never condones violence, but the way of Jesus is nonviolent. We no longer dismiss the Sermon on the Mount as a, quote, impossible ideal, whether counsel for the especially holy or a command that drives imperfect believers toward grace. Jesus commands and demonstrates love of enemies and non-retaliation. Paul not only greets the assemblies with grace and peace in every epistle, he speaks of the God of peace on 6 occasions. Yet Willard Swartley has documented a profound lack of engagement with peace and treatments of New Testament ethics. And Richard Hayes, though recognizing just war as the prevailing witness in Christian history, points out that just war theory has no grounding in the New Testament. On the contrary, the New Testament is, quote, quoting Hayes, impressively univocal in affirming Jesus' command that disciples practice non-retaliation. It is unclear to me that Jesus was a pacifist in the sense we intend today. Jesus indeed taught non-retaliation and blessed peacemakers, although in his teachings he used violence, even warfare, metaphorically. Without question, Jesus' followers should practice peace, pursue peace, and seek to avoid or minimize conflict. Yet Jesus never weighs in on the theoretical question of whether his followers might use force to defend an innocent person, or whether nations might rightly go to war to defend their populations and others from aggression. The New Testament, we remember, emerges from people for whom war was very bad news indeed, from assemblings and gatherings that had no real power to affect the course of war. The early Christian assemblies could suffer warfare, participate in armies, and so forth, but they could not affect the decisions of rulers and warlords. The New Testament does not speak to the political question of warfare directly, because it doesn't lie within the capacity of its audiences to make such decisions. I cannot escape the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Although he may not have been the absolute pacifist he sometimes portrayed to be, including by myself in previous writings, Bonhoeffer was a prominent member of the international peace movement. And yet he later involved himself in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler. Many interpreters regard Bonhoeffer to have regarded that choice as inherently sinful and at the same time necessary. In other words, Bonhoeffer came to understand a disciple's responsibility in extreme situations to involve implicating oneself in sin in order to serve God's purposes. One cannot escape this world innocent. War is evil. And many of us live in nations that are participating in this evil. We in the United States recognize that our own record is scarcely spotless, that we have not devoted the same level of attention to the violence suffered by Uyghurs in China, the non-Burmese in Burma, Palestinians in their homeland, and the people of Yemen, among other examples. Moreover, Ukraine and Russia may be the only nations engaging in direct combat, but many nations, including the United States, are participants in this war. None of these truths absolves us of Jesus' warning in Luke 13. Unless we repent, we will all likewise perish. Russia's aggression against Ukraine repeats patterns we've seen before in history, not least when millions of Ukrainians died under planned starvation, outright killing, and forced deportation by the Soviets less than 100 years ago, followed by still more killing perpetrated by the Nazis. Nor are Ukrainians pure from evil. Atrocities occur in every war and on all sides. Despite debates in the foreign policy establishment, however, Russia elected this war. Russia determined to raise cities and target civilians. Russia is credibly accused of genocide. The Ukrainians have chosen between the evil of accepting this aggression and the evil of war. Here in the United States and in the rest of the world, no option presents itself that is not inherently evil. Therefore, repenting, I support participation in the war by free powers in the form of supplying humanitarian and military aid. God forgive us. I'd planned in my talk right there, but in hearing Yury's comments, I wanted to add one consideration. The authoritarian Christian nationalism we're experiencing in the United States has marked parallels with religious nationalism in India, in other countries, and very clearly in Russia. And that is a factor we need to name in taking account of a Christian response or articulating a Christian response to this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. It is a very good application of the lessons from the Bible. So now we are turning to the case of South Korea. Let me share my PowerPoint. I myself and Professor Yoon have prepared for this presentation entitled Korean War, Recovery, and Religion through the lens of North Korean refugees. So I'm a kind of person belonging to post-war generation in Korean context. The Korean War is being forgotten by post-war generation, unfortunately. How should we remember the past war that happened in the year of 1950 through 1953? This is a maybe kind of way of understanding the Korean War, probably by post-war generation in Korean context. As you can see, this is a massacre in Korea, painted by Pablo Picasso. This painting describes a scene of a massacre of naked women and children by firing squad. Probably this painting refers to a critique of American intervention in the Korean War. Probably many, though not all, post-war younger generation still try to remember the Korean War from this kind of perspective. This is another way of remembrance of the Korean War. This movie is entitled Brotherhood, English title. The storyline is very similar to that can Saving Private Ryan in the year of 1998. The story concerns a series of anti-communism, patriotism, and feminism. Probably my father, who went through the Korean War, remembers the Korean War from this kind of perspective. Nowadays, I personally find huge gaps between war generation and post-war generation. To be honest, I used to have a quarrel with my father regarding any issues related to politics in South Korea. For me, he's always an anti-communist and just a staunch rightist. On the contrary, I'll call myself a post-colonial critic, which would stand more toward the theology of liberation. Actually, it was so hard for me to communicate to my father, who is a rightist and anti-communist Christian. But a couple of years ago, immediately after the death of my mother, I had a chance to have a very deeper conversation with my father. It's about his experience of the Korean War. He experienced the Korean War when he was 4 years old. I did start to understand his experience through his lens as a North Korean kid who was only 4 years old. According to him, he witnesses some murders of North Korean civilians by communists. It was so brutal and inhumane. His ideas are all from his own experience of the war itself. It's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of survival, regardless of ideological preferences. I began to change my attitudes in understanding his position and his experience. By listening to his story, I was enabled to listen very carefully to what he experienced. Then I could have a deeper understanding about his experience. And I began to have some empathy in his experience. Finally, I started to take care of his experience and emotion. How to understand the crisis in Ukraine? Just as a person belonging to a post-war generation would have difficulties in understanding the experience of war generation's experience. It would be so much challenging for us to understand it. But I believe the first step for us to do is to listen very carefully to the experience of the Ukrainians. And we can have a more deepened understanding of their experience. And we begin to have a kind of empathy in their own situation. We may take some immediate actions in the mood of solidarity, and we can transform ourselves. Finally, I would like to introduce to you a book written by a Korean anthropologist. His name is Hyun-ik Kwon. He's teaching at University of Cambridge. He wrote a very decent book titled After the Korean War, an intimate history. Let me read his statement. The key word for these artworks, he's referring to the cover, the painting of this cover. The key word for these artworks is exploration for the future, rather than representation of historical reality, arguing that these Korean War generation artists are preoccupied with the theme of family because of their desire to recover through art their families that have been broken apart by war. These works constitute, according to him, an aesthetical reaction to the violence and madness of the political system. Actually, I do remember my father used to say he wants to have a very beautiful family. I didn't used to understand his mindset. But when I found this book and read this portion of page, I began to understand his mindset much better. He wants to recover his family that he lost during the Korean War. And he wants to recover a larger family by converting Christianity. We might try to understand the power of religion. Sometimes it may be abused or misused, but at the same time, it can empower people to get over their difficulties of life through the religious imagination. My colleague, Professor Yoon, will cover the section on North Korean refugees. Professor Yoon, are you ready?
Yes. Before I begin, I must say thank you to Professor Avvakumov, Professor Carey, Professor Torre, and Professor Lim for your so informative and also inspiring and beautiful remarks. I believe it's such an unusual opportunity to hear about such remarks on war from such diverse perspectives. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm so glad I can add on to that. So Professor Lim, thank you for your remark, which I believe connects so well to what I prepared. So let me share my own PowerPoint. So although the Korean War is over, or at least is on a long-term hiatus, the aftermath of it has been deeply ingrained. So it has impacted both the political system and the everyday lives of Koreans. The emotional suffering has led to despair and hostility, impacting the way South Koreans and North Koreans look at each other and treat each other, as well as the way South Koreans and North Koreans look at and treat themselves. This is true even for the generations that have not experienced the war. In other words, we are living in a world of violence. Surprisingly, but perhaps not surprisingly as well, the Christian church is intensifying this violence by offering a variety of theological groundings, for example, a distorted understanding of God's message in the Bible, like Professor Avvakumov and Professor Carey just mentioned as well. And in this situation, unavoidable moral questions arise. How do we respond to violence? How do we respond to evil? With what attitudes, thoughts, actions, and identities are we to express, given our past traumatic experiences and memories? How are we to promote peace? As I explore these questions from the perspective of Christian ethics, I would like to provide an examination of the lingering hostility between North Korean refugees and the South Korean church. Specifically, the maladjustment of North Korean refugees to the South Korean church. By the way, the word maladjustment here, North Korean refugees, estrangement or alienation from the South Korean church, I mean. This has been one of the results of the Korean War. North Korean refugees, maladjustment happens in many different sectors in South Korea, but the church as a place of community reveals a divergent reality of welcoming and supporting refugees and ostracizing and excluding them at the same time. The number of North Korean refugees in South Korea has been growing steadily since the food shortage of the early 1990s. And since 2000, more than 1,000 refugees have arrived each year. Connected to the increase in this population, there has been a rapid increase in North Korean refugees visiting South Korean churches in recent years. However, research shows that more than 2/3 of the refugees have difficulty adjusting to their faith community and consider leaving, as these churches are not fulfilling their material, emotional, or spiritual needs. Also, unresolved tensions exist at the interpersonal as well as more systemic and collective levels. These very tensions exist between the refugees and the South Korean church. The responsibility for these tensions and the refugees' maladjustment comes from both the South Korean congregations and the refugees themselves. I will argue that both the North Korean refugees and the South Korean church are responsible in specific ways. So on the one hand, the South Korean church congregation holds deeply rooted prejudices against the refugees. This is one of the main reasons for the enduring antagonism. The congregation tends to have a sense of superiority and creates an invisible hierarchy based on nationality within the community. So just a short disclaimer that I really don't want to underestimate the South Korean church's sympathetic attitudes and their actions of care toward the refugees. There are a lot of churches that stay sympathetic, but I wanted to point out the deeply ingrained antagonism that's revealed both directly and indirectly. So I've spoken with many North Korean refugees through my research who have had an experience of attending churches in South Korea. And in my interviews, many of them stated that although the South Korean church members show sympathy and state a desire to help them, they have both direct and indirect expressions of superiority, tribalism, and the desire to retain a concentration of power, which has reinforced their sense of inferiority. Furthermore, church programs that do not sufficiently consider the refugees' particular realities and life experiences solidify systemic discrimination and exclusion. And in addition to South Korean churches, North Korean refugees are also responsible for their maladjustment to church. The biggest factors for this are their unrealistic expectations for financial and other forms of practical help, and their insufficient understanding of the faith community, the meaning of faith community. Also, the refugees' lack of positivity and honesty born out of their traumatic experiences is another contributing force. Since the refugees have lived under repressive and strict surveillance in North Korea, they have a great deal of resentment and frustration and tend to be sensitive, defensive, and distrustful, and also critical. So through the historical events of the Korean War and the division of Korea, both the South Korean church and North Korean refugees have been perpetrators who have attacked the other, but at the same time, both groups have also been victims. They have both been hurt by the socio-political structures that have fostered animosity against the other. The South Korean church has excluded the refugees and understood them to be traitors. But at the same time, I'll continue, but at the same time has remained perplexed under socio-political, domestic, and international dynamics. Their context particularly relates to Christian ethicist Miroslav Volf's statement that today's church is the worst place where conflicts occur due to the overriding commitment to its culture. This is due to the tendency of communities to be trapped within their own cultural identity markers, which function as tools to formulate a new tribalism. The Korean church context demonstrates the irony of the church serving as a place which is presumed to be a space of reconciliation, but rather is experienced as a place of excluding other cultures and rigidity. Based on his criticism, Wolf urges Christians to depart from their own culture without leaving in order to enact reconciliation, which can be done by making space for the other to enter in. Although one does not need to abandon his or her own culture, it is necessary to forego a sense of superiority about one's own culture in order to understand and learn from other cultures. Reconciliation could be a way to step out of enmeshment in the network of inherited cultural relations and embrace others who are different from us. This analysis provides insights about the necessity for the South Korean Church to release their deeply established prejudices and sense of superiority. In addition, the refugees' traumatic experiences as refugees should be listened to and understood with humility. In an environment where the two groups could positively interact with one another, the refugees could gradually begin to have their emotional and spiritual needs met. Moreover, the refugees also need to make an effort to have positive and more open perspectives toward others. They really do not need to deny or erase their emotional scars from their refugee experiences. Rather, they need courage to be able to tell their unique stories and develop an openness to learning. The reconciliation process should be entered as an ongoing process, since the refugees' negative attitudes and psychological wounds are deep and were formed over a long period of time as well. So speaking generally, reconciliation will need to be an ongoing process and will require time and patience and gradual and consistent efforts on both sides. This work will bring both sides into a position of embracing, and this will lead to the full integration of the refugees into the South Korean Church. So as the dialogues between South and North Korea and between North Korea and the international countries surrounding the Korean Peninsula are taking a new turn, there is a rising interest in the topic of whether the conflict between the two Koreas will finally end. So talks and negotiations among the South Korean, North Korean, and the US government are aimed at bringing about agreement on such matters. For example, the declaration of the end of the Korean War, the denuclearization of North Korea, and a peace treaty, and so on. Of course, reconciliation in politics and systemic change are crucial on their own. But even when systemic change is achieved, if the lingering hostility and antagonism are not resolved, the true meaning of peace, where social values such as harmony, justice, and equality are promoted, won't be achieved. For this peace, the church should become one of the places where fundamental change happens. Considering the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly the deeply ingrained and long-lasting impacts of it on various dimensions of life, it's going to be a meaningful time to discuss the role of the church and religion, and also the role of the international countries, and for example, how can we solidarize with each other, and how can we really put into practice the actions of care? Such questions, it's going to be a worthy time to discuss them in efforts to overcome exclusion and promote reconciliation and peace. That's the end of my part. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Yoon. So far we have dealt with what in Ukraine from a historical, ethical, biblical, theological, and religious perspective. So now, I do want to have a Q&A section. First, between the speakers, and second, between the speaker and audience. I believe the speakers must have some thoughts and idea to discuss with the others speakers. So please bring in any question for the other speaker. Yeah, it's a kind of must be very kind of there's dialogue between us. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that I heard, especially from those of us who are focused on what's going on in Ukraine, is this sense that there are moments when there's conflict and taking sides can't be avoided. I guess in noting that, I'm trying to draw out Yury a little more, who offered such compelling, I mean, this is, as he stated, this is a division within the church. And in that sense, it, you know, here in the United States, we tend to underinterpret it as a religious war or as a war of colonialism. But I noticed that among the three of us, this sort of acknowledgement that any kind of peacemaking that avoids conflict is not an adequate response to this moment.
So if I may ask you to specify, Greg, so you're asking whether any other kind of peacemaking except this this violent type which is occurring now, whether it is still preferable and possible in current conditions, or did I understand you correctly?
I think so, and I would just add that that's painful. That's a painful reality from a Christian theological perspective.
Yeah, I would agree, although I would not be totally negative towards the just war tradition. So it is still a part, at least, yeah, from the Catholic perspective, it is a part of the Catholic tradition, and I understand the concern of contemporary theologians and social ethicists about the war in the 20th and 21st century, about these totally new conditions, totally new level of warfare, which we have to confront, to face today. And still, I think there are, maybe we need a different terminology. Maybe we need to go away from the concept of just war as we had it. Maybe it is a justice of self-defense. Yeah. And there are various approaches to this question, to the question of just war. But in the recent literature, I find really quite a few attempts to employ this tradition, the just war tradition, perhaps in a different, in a slightly differentiated, in a more differentiated way, but still to the conflicts of our day. And I'm basically would rather be sympathetic with this, maybe as a historian, as someone whose you know, academic preference and the nature of historical research is the concern with the individuality, not a concern with the theory, be it even a ethical theory or a social ethical theory, and this concern with the individual, with the individuality, somehow forbids me to remain without action in the face of this. If we speak in particular about Russia and Ukraine, in this particular case, in the face of this evil aggression, So in my view, I would still be looking for the elements, at least the elements of the just war tradition that still could be applied, that are still applicable to the situation like the Russian war against Ukraine. If this is something that can be seen as an attempt of an answer to your question, Greg.
Well, I appreciate Yury's response. I might have a bit of a different take on just war theory. I have a more negative view of it. Basically, because when Augustine develops this just war theory, I see it as a way of providing the empire the opportunity to engage in war. I remember when George Bush Sr. was about to go to war with Iraq over the invasion of Kuwait. He was very careful in following the just war theory, so to develop this idea that we're doing it correctly. I kind of like where, Greg, you left off in your talk, in where you basically, and I agree, all war is, there's nothing just about any war. But I would rather say I'm going to engage in self-defense, knowing that I should not retaliate and knowing that this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway because we live in a world in where we are all complicit with violence in some way or another. I have a fear that once we begin to define a war as just, it becomes a way for politicians to quickly define any conflict as somehow just. And we see this throughout history, obviously. So I guess I'm not as sold on the just war theory and the way it has been used.
I'm mindful that we heard from I-Sil and Sung-Up, you know, the cost of violence is multi-generational. We know that's going to be true in Ukraine. It's going to be true in Russia, though I think we're biased rightly toward, you know, those who are the targets of aggression. But I heard that strongly too. I started to say this morning.
Actually, it just can be maybe concern the question of probably to kind of ethics. Actually, as part of my presentation, I mentioned any potential conflict between war generation and post-war generation in Korean context. And then, for me, I don't belong to the camp of my father's kind of political side at all. But always I had to have some kind of conflict with my father, right, personally, because of the difference of kind of ideological preferences. But as I told you guys, sometimes I could find kind of hatred even among leftists toward rightists, right? So we would always kind of we have always been critical of the hatred of the rightists, right? From a kind of ideal perspective, but we might have kind of some problem in understanding even the rightists. I'm not saying that they are right always, but I'm trying to kind of understand the experiences. And in the case of my father, what do you think about this kind of tension between kind of what theologically or ideologically different camps within ourselves? What do you think?
Hearing you, I could relate to this tension. I was born in the midst of a revolution in my country, and we are refugees because of the war that occurred in Cuba in 1959. And that hatred that you mentioned has been part of my family's legacy from my father and my mother, because they lost everything.
Sure.
And when you lose everything and now you're a refugee in a country that doesn't want you there, it shapes one's life in very profound ways. And even now, and some 60 plus years later, even though I have moved away from the hatred of my father, it still grips my heart because I still know that pain that I witnessed in them. So yes, I hear your struggle with your father, who actually went through the war as a small child. I went through as a small child myself, and it damages you. So the psychological damage that the war in the Ukraine or any war whatsoever has on children, it's just going to make our society as a world even more problematic. And not just the children of war, I'm thinking also of the children who are undocumented immigrants in this country, in the United States, who are being placed in cages and being placed in detention camps in Torre, Texas. Those children, even though there's no bombs being dropped, are also experience the trauma of war, and their lives are also going to be negatively impacted, impacting the next generation onward. So, yeah, this is probably one of the reasons why I struggle with these issues of war and how to deal with it, because it destroys families.
Sure.
Thank you to Dr. Ray, and I would like to add on to that a little bit. And I believe the tension, Professor Lim, you were experiencing with your dad was not just interpersonal, but deeply systemic and institutionalized. So it's both ways, I believe. So it's interpersonal because like you mentioned, you two were not able to understand each other and not empathize or sympathize with each other. However, I think under the historical events, I mean, a lot of people, we were drained like about the like negative connotations of like the other. So that kind of prevented us from thinking positively like about embracing each other, but we just start with the hostility, the deeply rooted antagonism, and then that's the basis. So like Professor de la Torre said, it damages ourselves, right? It changes the way we treat ourselves and we look at ourselves. So it's not only damaging others when we discriminate other people, it just damages ourselves as well. So at the end of my speech, I mentioned that even when the systemic change happens, if the interpersonal level of embracement doesn't happen, the true meaning of peace cannot be realized. However, I think that that's vice versa as well. Even when the interpersonal attitudes change, the institutional level of changes don't happen. I mean, the true meaning of peace cannot be achieved. And in order for the systemic change to happen, I mean, different groups really have to cooperate with each other, and the church has a very important role in that, like by mediating the church congregations in non-religious groups and also governmental and non-governmental organizations. So much to do in the part of the church. So that's a little bit of my thought on that.
Yury, I really appreciate your idea about the colonialistic aspect of the crisis in Ukraine. And then actually, as a post-colonial critic, it was very interesting to hear about that. And I do agree, sometimes religion would contribute to the strengthening of the colonialism or imperialism, right? So actually, one audience kind of gave us kind of very interesting kind of question to think about. Hold on, let me read her question. This is from Lynette Lee. The language of war, militarization, and conquest are so embedded in the Christian rhetoric, liturgy, and theology, probably even in the Bible, right, Rick? Too often, the church is complicit and has conspired to colonization. So, what have we repented? What are the laments for? Have we decentered our theologies away from imperialistic and colonialistic theologies? Yeah. This is very kind of important question for all of us to think about and answer. What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think that this tradition ingrained in Christian theology has a very, very early provenience. Actually, so early as at least the Constantinian Theodosian Christianity itself. And one example could be the Council of Nicaea 325 and its consequences, which is going to be celebrated soon. And there is so much talk about the importance of the Nicene dogma and so on and so forth, which is of course very important. But from a historian's point of view, I would say, and I would see quite a few and actually a huge complex of problematic sides of this council and its consequences towards the Council of 381 and towards the persecution of the Arian party and further the persecution of the Arians. And here we have indeed the violence against the dissenters and those who think otherwise, differently, actually almost ingrained in the depths of the Christian theological tradition. And so I think we really, as theologians and church historians, we must deal with this question. We must confront ourselves with this, face ourselves with this question. So I have no ready recipes, but I think the deconstruction of this tradition is in any way absolutely necessary.
Actually, I do remember Yury kind of labeled Russian Orthodox Church as a pseudo-Christianity. I was impressed by the kind of terminology. And then actually I did think about the opposite of pseudo-Christianity, kind of from a historical perspective. Then we should kind of go back to the original kind of teaching, right, Greg? So do you think that is there any kind of quote unquote Orthodox Christianity and pseudo Christianity in the time of Jesus? So how can you reconstruct the message of Jesus? Or is it message imperialistic or anti-imperialistic or both imperialistic and anti-imperialistic? How can we recover the message of Jesus nowadays, Greg?
You just asked 12 conferences worth of questions, right?
Sorry about that.
So I'll just try to be concise. One, I understand and I guess endorse using the language of pseudo-Christianity But I think it has a problem, which is it distances expressions of Christianity that have Christian roots that are perverse, right? It is a perverse, the Ruski Mir ideology, as I understand it, is perverse and has been identified in that way. It is not entirely absent from even our biblical heritage to claim nationalistic or ethnic categories of identification. So just naming that. And then the second item I would think about is, you know, when we talk about identifying the way of Jesus, we can talk about some core activities that it seems clear Jesus was involved in, or core teachings. And they tend to be acts of healing and community building, right? He's around ordinary people. He's speaking to their lives. He's traveling. He's eating with people who are identified as sinners. Those are core things we recognize. He's talking about God in a particular way, as one who looks after those who are mourning and those who are lowly. In other words, those who are suffering the effects of exploitation and violence. He names as blessed. Almost all historians can agree on those things, which is different than identifying a doctrinal orthodoxy to attach to Jesus. We could talk about the kinds of practices and activities that surround that early movement. I hope that's a helpful reply.
And yet I wonder, from that early movement, within a short time period, you have somebody like a Justin Martyr come along who basically said that the religion of the other people are really satanic. And so I agree that Constantine really moved forward this imperial Christianity, but it also, I mean, its roots, I'm wondering, even if it goes back to Paul and even Jesus himself, that there are some seeds there that could be problematic because when we look at Christianity, it is probably the procurer of the most violent, genocidal ideology the world has ever seen. From the wiping out of the indigenous people in the name of Jesus and the cross in the Americas, to the Crusades, to the religion, we all know. I mean, and even today, as Greg, you're mentioning, with the rise of nationalist Christianity in this country, I'm to a point that when people tell me they're Christian, it scares me. You know, when people have a Bible and approach me in love, I mean, I want to run away, because it is literally the cause of so much human suffering. So I like the idea of going back to the basics of Jesus, but then later maybe I drank too much of the Foucault Kool-Aid, but I'm wondering, what is the essence of Jesus? I mean, what was those, you know, is that essence really my projection of what I think that essence is? And everything you said, I agree with. I mean, I like the, you know, being with the people and the poor and healing the sick. I mean, that's the kind of Jesus I like, but I also have to have that hermeneutical suspicion of, am I imposing my own desires of what I want this Christianity to be? So it really becomes for me, it becomes how much of this Christianity this liberationist that I want to hug and I want to hold on to, how much of this is just my own projection onto Jesus? And it sounds good to me, so that's what I'm going to go with. And everyone else who's on the imperial road, I'm against, and they're the ones that were pseudo. But maybe I'm also pseudo, in a good way. But still, I have to also be aware of that, because if not, then I'm no better than saying that my way is the correct way.
Without question. I mean, I think several of us are enough informed by post-colonial thought to recognize that Jesus describes God as a king who makes war. So
Yes, absolutely. So there are those seeds within the gospel itself that are problematic and that we just need to be wrestling with.
This might be kind of last question, maybe. This is kind of question can belong to all of us. Actually, we Koreans are turning to the 72nd anniversary of the Korean War, and then I do remember this war caused by the conflicts between superpowers such as America, Russia, China, Japan, and so on. And doing that actually as a Korean, South Korean, I would always kind of be conscious about any potential conflict between China and USA, between Russia and USA, between Japan and South Korea, and between North and South Koreans. And I believe the crisis in Ukraine must have something to do with this kind of geopolitical clashes, right? So I do remember in the midst of the Yury's kind of presentation, you did mention kind of great Russia or great America again, or great China. Nowadays, as a South Korean, I would be threatened a lot by these imperialistic and colonialistic slogans. It's very truly applicable to the life context of South Koreans, and I believe the same thing should be applicable to the crisis in Ukraine too. So how can we resolve this kind of imperialistic and colonialistic slogans in our context? We do belong, we are living in a different parts of the world. So how can we resolve? How can we interact with this kind of imperialistic and colonialistic, imperialistic slogans based on our own context? Do you have any ideas, guys?
It reminds me of Professor Avvakumov's remark on the Christian church's engagement, like both politically and morally. So I believe that the church can play a very important role politically as well, although it cannot resolve like everything about the political conflicts. However, it can really advocate like politically for the socially oppressed. Seriously, with the Christian foundings. The Christian message is not distorted, but like you mentioned, we have to go back to the original message of the Bible, and then we have to see the Bible on the whole, not through a selective reading of it. The Christian church can provide the fundamental groundings to stop the political conflicts and protect the socially oppressed, and then advocate for the oppressed. That's one of the thoughts I have.
Actually, as Greg suggested, we have lots of good questions from the chat box. Let me read one question for you guys. The war started and a lot of supply ran out. I know that many people also bought a lot of Bible. Okay, I thought the extreme situation was causing spiritual exhaustion. However, Ukraine is not an environment that can help them with their personal hardships. What is the fundamental cause of the church's impediment to providing help to all who suffer? Do you have any ideas about this question? Greg?
I'm trying not to speak too much. I would just say Christians are people. So much of what we've said about Christianity and our critique, we are people, and we do things people do. Other people do wonderful things and commit atrocities, and so have many of us.
Probably this is the last question, probably. Yeah. So actually we have already gone to about 2 hours already. So probably it's time for us to call it a day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And my greatest thanks go to the speakers and the audience on behalf of Dean of College of Theology and United Great School of Theology, Professor Samuel Pang. I want to say goodbye to all of you, and I ask you to pray for Ukrainians, and I ask you to take some actions, immediate or immediate, to help them out. So yeah, there must be kind of various ways of helping them out. And actually, a couple of days ago, my institution has a big hospital, and then the doctors and nurses kind of made a great sum of donation for the Ukrainians, and it was sent over to the embassy, the Ukrainian embassy in South Korea. So I believe you guys have lots of ways of kind of embodying our good thoughts in our real actions. And I believe all the speakers have mentioned the significant solidarity in the name of love of God and Jesus. And I hope that peace will come soon in the land of Ukraine. And thank you very much for your great questions and conversation. Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.